maybe a decade ago, it was, we had some family hanging out at our house that were staying for a weekend. My younger brother and his wife were here, and it was on a weekend, which means that they were here for a Sunday morning. And often I'm out of the house early on a Sunday morning, and my kids were very little at the time. And so my sister-in-law was up before other people in my family were up, and I was already out of the house. And one of my sons came downstairs. He was about 5 years old at the time, and he comes downstairs, just a look of concern, and he's looking around, and he's like, and my sister-in-law says, "What's the matter?" He's like, and his tears are like coming in his eyes, and he's like, "Did my dad leave for church already?" And she said, "Yeah." He's like, "Oh." And she thought, man, that's so cute and heartwarming that he misses his dad, and he came downstairs and wants to know where his dad is. And then he looks up to her and he says, "Do you know if he brought his iPad with him?" I don't know if you've ever felt that, where you're like, what am I, chopped liver? Like people are more interested in what you bring and the stuff that you have than they are interested in you. We have this phrase, and I don't know if you heard that phrase before, what am I, chopped liver? But sometimes we feel like that. And that's actually a phrase that references a Jewish appetizer that people would eat before their main course. And it was a very small appetizer. It was usually chicken liver, and it was inexpensive, and it was common, and it was just like everybody kind of had it, and it was the thing that you would eat before the main dish. And so when we say that phrase, it's like, you're not the main thing. People came for something else other than you. And as a dad, and in many other relationships, I felt that many times in my life, and maybe you have felt that. But Jesus also felt that. If you've ever felt that people were more interested in what you had and what you could bring and what good you could bring to their life more than they were interested in you, this is actually, for many situations, the story that Jesus experienced over and over and over again. And so as Jesus was doing his earthly ministries, he's doing these miracles, and we're in the book of John looking at the miracles of Jesus. And he's doing these earthly miracles. And people just were infatuated by what he could do. They were loving what he could do. They were, they started following him. They started whispering about him. They were telling rumors about what they had heard, what they had seen. And we've looked at a few of those miracles already. He did some cool things like multiplying he changed the water into wine. He healed the nobleman's son. He healed the lame guy like we talked about last week. And there was other miracles that he was doing. And so people were talking about this, and crowds were forming, and they began following him. And Jesus comes to the situation in John 6, and we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And we can maybe think about the story as bread and fish and chopped liver, because people came looking for a sign, a miracle, and Jesus wanted them to find himself. Jesus wanted to find true life. And so we are looking at the 7 miracles of Jesus. John tells us that he did 7 miracles. He did more than 7 miracles, but he says, I'm telling you these miracles because I want to show you something about who Jesus is. And so we're looking at the most famous miracle this morning. Like I said, the feeding of the 5,000. And this is the most famous miracle, other than the resurrection of Jesus, because it was such a public miracle. Outside of the resurrection, this is the only miracle that is told in all 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all refer to this miracle, probably because it was so well known. And that's probably because there was thousands of people that were there, more than 5,000. 5,000 was the number of men that were there. So there's probably about 15,000 or more when you count women and children that were a part of the crowd that witnessed this miracle. And if it hadn't really happened, there's no way it would have made it into your Bibles. And so this is important for us to think about when we look at the accounts of some of these miracles. If these things weren't true, John's book was written about 30 or 40 years after the events that are being described. There's 15,000 plus that are at this miracle. And if it didn't really happen within 30 or 40 years, there would have been thousands of people that could testify to that miracle happening. And if it didn't happen, people were like, that never happened. That wasn't true. But this is shared in all 4 Gospels. The gospel writers weren't shy about sharing the story, and all 4 of them say that there were thousands upon thousands of people that witnessed this event. Miracle number 4, we're going to read it in a second, but you'll see that Jesus multiplies loaves and there's an abundance at the end of the story. And miracle number 1, which was water turning into wine, if you remember, there was abundance of wine. And so Jesus, by the end of the gospel, will tell us that he is, when he breaks the bread at the Last Supper and he gives wine to his disciples, he says, "This bread is my body broken for you. This wine is my blood spilt for you." Miracle number 1, Jesus does this incredible miracle where he changes water to wine in abundance, and there was more wine there than anybody could possibly drink. Miracle number 4, Jesus multiplies these loaves, and as you're going to see, there's leftovers and there's more than people can actually possibly eat. And so part of what John wants us to see, remember, he's using the word signs when he talks about miracles. So he's not just telling us about events, he's wanting us to see what are these signs, what are these miracles pointing towards. And we know that they're pointing towards Jesus, and Jesus with miracle 1 and miracle 4 is telling us, no matter your story, no matter where you're coming from, there is more than enough for you when you come to me. Whatever lack you might feel, there is no lack in me. In fact, I'm not just going to come and help you survive. I'm just going to do the bare minimum for you. I want your life to be overflowing. He says in John 10, I want you to experience full life in all of its fullness. And so in the first miracle and the fourth miracle, Jesus is showing us through these miracles that when we come to him with our lives, with our challenges, with our questions, with our problems, the end of the story is there is way more than enough for you, no matter what your story is. So we're in sign number 4, like I said. I'm going to read the text, and then we're going to dive into it together. I'm going to invite you to stand as we read God's word together. And I'm going to read 1 to 15, and then a couple of verses later on in chapter 6 here. So John 6, starting in verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed it to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the signs Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is going to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." This is the word of the Lord. You can have a seat. So John begins and he says, sometime after this, the events that we just looked at last week, the healing story, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. So if you remember the story that we told last week was around near Jerusalem, and now Jesus is all the way back up in Galilee, which is a multiple-day journey. And so he's back kind of in his home area, home territory, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he performed to the sick. And so People weren't just coming that were local. Like, people were starting to follow him around all over the place. They were starting to follow him on long journeys. They weren't content just to see him in one location and let him go off. It's like he started like picking up, there was like this gravitational experience as Jesus went around. People were being drawn to him and started following him all over the place from town to town. And so the crowd is growing. People are intrigued. And John says that they're following him because they saw the signs that he had performed by the sick. You and I would probably do the same. Jesus is doing these things that you've never seen happen before. And it seems like everywhere he goes, life just starts happening. People start getting healed. Things are changing. And so you're following him on one hand because you want to see what he's going to do. But on the other hand, maybe if I'm around him enough, my life is going to change. Then Jesus went up to the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover was near. And so Jesus went to the mountainside because this is where he would go to try and get away from the crowds. We'll see that didn't work out very well. So he goes with the disciples to get away from the crowds. The Jewish Passover was near. The time of day was around lunchtime. And so this is a lunch scene. And so when I can relate to this, the people here, or the disciples there, they didn't have food. The crowd's going to show up. They didn't have food. They didn't have a way to get food. And so this is kind of setting the scene for the context of the story. And I remember growing up, and I was in high school, and I too, like the people in the story, never brought my lunch to high school. I'm almost ashamed to say this, but I never brought a lunch. You know what I would do? I would beg. People had way better lunches than I did, and when I couldn't get a lunch from my friends, I would ask people for money. In the cafeteria, it was like $1 to get like a little pita thing, and I'm like, surely every day I can find $1. And sure enough, like I would go to school, one way or another, I'd take lunch from a friend, or I'd beg for money, and somebody would be gracious to me in the cafeteria, and I'd get $1 or $2, and I would feed myself that way. Now, it would have been atrocious if I would have showed up at school and nobody brought lunch and nobody had money. Then what would I have done? And this is the situation that we find in John 6. Everybody's following Jesus. They're mostly concerned with the signs. They're not even thinking about lunch. They show up in this situation where there's thousands of people. And so we're at the lunch hour, and this kind of sets the scene for the event. So when Jesus looked up, he saw a great crowd coming towards him. He's thinking, oh, great. I've been doing ministry, I've been busy, I've been walking days, I've been healing people, and he's just trying to get away, and he looks up and he sees this crowd of people showing up. And so he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" So why does he ask Philip? I mean, he's got 12 disciples. He could ask any one of them, and John very specifically tells us he asked Philip. Well, we know that earlier in John tells us in chapter 1 that Philip and Andrew are from this region. I don't know if you've ever gone to a city where you got some friends and you're trying to figure out where to eat, and you say, hey, can you tell us where's a good place to eat? You're a local. This is that kind of situation. Or you go to a restaurant you've never been at before, and the waitress is there, and she's asking you what you want to order. And you say, what do I recommend? I think there's two types of people in the world. Those who ask, what do you recommend? And those of you that just order off the menu. How many people ask the waitress, what do you recommend? Without fail, that's me every single time. And my wife gets so annoyed. She's like, why do you always ask that? Because I usually ask, what do you recommend? And she'll say this or that. And I said, I'm not going to get either of those. I'm going to get this. She's like, why do you even ask her? It's like, I'm actually wanting her to affirm the decision I was already making. And if she says, I recommend this thing, and it's the thing I had in my mind, then it's going to be mind-blowing. But I end up doing what I want anyways. But this is kind of the situation. Jesus is in Andrew's area. He's in Philip's area. He turns to Philip, and he says, Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? But the next line is fascinating. John says he asked this only to test him, for he already had in his mind what he was going to do. So Jesus actually knew the answer to the question. Jesus wasn't asking Philip just because he was a local. Well, that was part of it. But he's asking Philip because he's testing Philip because Philip is a local. And did you know that Jesus asked around 307 questions in the Gospels? And he directly only answers about 3 to 8 questions, depending on kind of how you read it. Think about that for a second. Jesus, the truth, the life, the one that came to reveal the good news to us, reveal the Father to us, shows up with more questions than answers. And we see in this text here that he asks a question to Philip, and he asks a question to Philip not because he doesn't know the answer. He asks a question to Philip because he wants Philip to realize Philip doesn't know the answer. When God comes to us with a question, just so you know, it's not because he doesn't know the answer. He's asking you and I questions because he wants us to wrestle with the question. He wants us to wrestle with, what are we going to do with that question? In fact, Jesus prefers to ask questions over answers because he's leading us somewhere with his questions. And so he asked the question to Philip to test him, to refine him, to transform him. There's something that he wants to do in Philip's life. And we'll see, Jesus had the resource just to give the answer. He had the resource to do what he was about to do. But he doesn't just do it because that's actually not his goal. His goal is to do something in Philip's life. His goal is to do something in Andrew's life. His goal is to do something with the crowd of people that are there. So he asked this to test him, for he already had in his mind what he wanted to do. And so why doesn't he just do it? Because the point is not what he's about to do. The point is what he wants to do in the lives of those who are witnessing the event. He doesn't just try and wow them with a miracle, because he's not a magician. He's trying to transform them because he's a Messiah. And this is why people keep missing the thing that Jesus is trying to do in John. This is why people keep looking at the miracles, and John is saying, Jesus didn't do these as miracles. He didn't do these as a magician. He is not just a miracle worker. He's not just trying to wow you. He's trying to do something in you, and that's why he's trying to show you something. And so Philip answered him. Philip brings his answer. It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. And so this translation does the work for us. The original text just says 200 denarii, which was about half a year's wages. So Philip was saying, the average person would work for half a year just to make enough money to feed all of these thousands of people. He's simply saying, Jesus, I don't have that kind of money. You don't have that kind of money. There's no resources around and available to do what you are looking to do. So they realized there was a problem. But Jesus asked him the question, knowing that there wasn't a human solution to the question that he was asking. Why? Because he wants to do something. And how is he going to do that? He's going to bring Philip to a place of despair where he has no answers to the question. He leads them to despair. He leads them to see that their resources are incomparably small to the challenges and questions that are before them in their life. And Jesus always does this. I think this is part of the reason why he asks questions. He's leading us with his questions. Why? Because he wants us to get to a place where we realize, I don't have an answer to these questions in my own life, within my own resources. I am powerless to do the thing, Jesus, that you're suggesting. And so he's leading them to despair. If you've ever been a part of any 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or another type of 12-step program, step one, what's the first step? The first step in a 12-step program is you are powerless to overcome your problem. That is step one. And thousands and millions of people have found transformation through these 12-step programs. But the idea is that you cannot move on to step two until you come to grips with step one. The good news, the gospel, the transformative work that Jesus wants to do in your life and in my life works the exact same way. We don't move on to the thing that Jesus wants to do in our lives until we get to the end of ourselves and our own resources and say, I don't know how to answer that question. You might be asking questions and waiting for Jesus to answer your questions. And perhaps he's not answering your questions because he's asking you a question. And that lack of answer you're looking for is slowly leading you to a place of despair. And I want to encourage you that despair is not the end of the story, but it's the necessary place that God wants to bring you and I to so that we can actually depend on him instead of just looking for the things that he can give us. So another of his disciples, Andrew, the other local guy, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and said, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" So Andrew's saying, yeah, there's no restaurants around here. We're in the middle of nowhere. And so I tried to find some resources, and I couldn't find much except these 5 barley loaves and these 2 small fish, which would be like sardine size, so it's not much. And Jesus, this is all I have. So Philip says, Jesus, there's not enough resources. There's no possibility to what you're asking to do. And Andrew says, this is all we've got, and it's not enough. And so both the local boys kind of get to despair, and they say, this is it. But there's also Andrew, we got Philip, and the third character we got in the story is a boy. And he's nameless. And we don't know, how this interaction came about where Andrew found this boy and how he got these loaves and the fish. But the boy shows up with the small lunch. And it's clear that this boy is poor because a barley loaf was the food of the poor in the first century. He's a little kid, he's a child, he's from a poor family, he's nameless in the story, he's insignificant in every kind of way in the story. And yet, in the hands of Jesus, the thing that is insignificant becomes significant. The thing that seems insufficient becomes sufficient. The nameless boy who gets half of a lion becomes the one that Jesus partners with to do something that Philip and Andrew said was impossible. So Jesus says, have the people sit down. There's plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves. What does he do? He gives thanks. He gives thanks. In all the accounts in the gospel, we see that Jesus gives thanks before he does the miracle. In the question, in the doubt, in the insufficiency, Jesus gives thanks. And then he starts distributing the bread to those who were seated. And you can kind of just imagine there's thousands of people, and Jesus gives thanks for these 5 loaves and these couple of little fish, and he starts breaking it off and giving it to people, and you're like this is Jesus. What are you doing? This isn't going to work. It's like you showed up at church and there's a communion table and you got a few wafer crackers and there's thousands of people. It's this is going to be lunch. It's this is not going to go very far. And so he keeps breaking it off and he keeps breaking it off and he keeps breaking it off, and there's more and there's more and there's more. And people keep eating and people keep eating. 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. And then John tells us that when they had all had enough to eat, when they all got filled up, when their stomachs were full, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. What a beautiful picture, hey? Not only did people get their full fill, but Jesus does over and above and abundantly more than anyone could have asked or imagined, and there's leftovers. In fact, there's so many leftovers that there's 12 baskets of leftovers. There could have been more than 12 baskets. We know they gathered at least 12 baskets, maybe because there's only 12 disciples and that's all they could have carried back. So they gathered them, they filled the 12 baskets with pieces of the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. Now that's my kind of lunch. I would give a 5-star review for that. I don't know about you, but when I go to a restaurant and there's like just a little bit of food, no matter how good the food is, it's not a 5-star restaurant to me. I don't understand this. I mean, some of you guys have a better palate than I do, but this idea of spending a lot of money on a little bit of food that doesn't fill you up makes zero sense to me. Please help me understand. Please help me understand. And it seems to me that the smaller the portions of food, the more expensive the restaurant. Like, this is just something that makes no sense to me. So this is a 5-star review event in my mind. You eat, you had your fill, and then you walk away, and there's takeout, there's leftovers. You're like, can I get containers to bring that home in? It's like, this was amazing, okay? So this is my kind of meal. There's abundance. There's abundance. People showed up with nothing, and they left with more than they could eat, more than they could take home. And after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. And then Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Jesus knew, and we see in John 2, there's another reference that Jesus knows the hearts of all men. In John 2, it says Jesus didn't entrust himself to people because he knew people's hearts. And so he's aware of motivations. He's aware of what's in the hearts of those around him. And he knows that people have an agenda for me that is different than the Father's agenda for me. People have an agenda for me to become king, but they have a certain idea about what me being king means. And make no doubt about it, Jesus was king. Jesus came to be the Messiah, which largely means to be king. And so everybody had this expectation on Jesus. Everybody saw the signs that Jesus was doing. Everybody started to have great plans for Jesus. I don't know if you've had great plans for Jesus in your life. Jesus, I got great plans for you. It'd be great if you did this. So this is what is happening. Thousands of people saying, I got a plan for your life. And Jesus says, I've got a plan for your life, but you're not going to experience it as long as you are focused on me getting on your agenda. People had an agenda that they wanted to get Jesus onto. And ironically, Jesus had an agenda that he wanted to get people onto. And the agenda that Jesus had was to give them life in all of its fullness. And if they got what they wanted, they wouldn't actually get full life. Many of us are open to Jesus, I think, as long as he stays on our agenda. And Jesus says, I am king. But if I'm the king that you just want me to be, the reality is that you're king and I'm not king. That's what that means. So he withdrew again. Like, I got to get away from these crowds again. I tried escaping the first time, and then they just all showed up, and so he withdrew again. He has these introvert moments, so everybody here who's an introvert, you can like, Jesus gets me. He gets me. I got to get away. So he withdraws again, get away by himself. Then John goes and tells another story that happened kind of in the middle, which we're going to look at that story next week. That's miracle number 5. But then it comes back to this story. And so he goes across the lake, goes to the other side of the lake, and when they found him on the other side of the lake, she's like, oh my goodness. So he takes the boat, and they're like, see Jesus. And they're like, they walk around the lake. They're like, we're going to go find him. And he gets a moment of reprieve, and then they showed up, and they're like, Rabbi, when did you get here? Leave the guy alone. And he says, Jesus answered, very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Jesus would say in John 10, I have come so that you may have life in all of its fullness. And the crowd comes and says, we have come that we may have bread and be filled. Jesus had an agenda, and it was different than their agenda. And so Jesus does the sign, this amazing sign. He multiplies the bread, and he says, you're all full. Your stomachs are full. You had more than you needed. You had leftovers. And now you keep following me because you had your fill, and you want more. And so we see that even when God shows up and he does something abundant and he gives blessing and he does something so powerful and transformative, something that was going to be talked about, that all these gospel writers were going to write about, something that people were going to talk about 2,000 years later of this miraculous event. Even when God shows up and does something amazing and brings blessing, people missed it. The danger of miracles, this is what John is saying, the danger of miracles, the danger of blessing, the danger of good things, is that as human beings, we tend to take good things and make them ultimate things. We tend to take the gifts that God brings. James says that every good and perfect gift comes from above. God gives good gifts, and the danger and the thing that we typically do is we take good gifts from God and we say, that gift is amazing, and we focus on the gift, and then once we have the gift, we say, I want more. Jesus said, you're just following me because you had your fill, and now you want more. And so here's the reality. The story in John 6 is a story of despair, of unanswered questions, and it's a story of blessing. The point wasn't despair, and the point wasn't blessing. I had someone say to me this morning, as the Canada game was still going on and we were showing it here, and they said, just curious, do you have one sermon if we win? And do you have one sermon if we lose? Because the room's going to be very different depending on what happens. And I said, I actually got a sermon that works for both. And so you might come in this morning full of despair, and you might come in this morning just being blessed by an abundance of things that God is doing in your life. But let me encourage you that when despair becomes the point, you miss the point. When blessing becomes the point, you miss the point. John's agenda is to say every good and perfect gift, everything that Jesus has done, it's all a sign. It's all pointing towards a greater reality. He's also saying every despair that you experience, every question that you can't answer, every thing in your life that you wish could change, and it's like a hunger and a thirst. John is saying, let that hunger and thirst lead you to the point of saying, Jesus, my only hope is you. I have no answer to the solution. I have no solution to the question and the thing that I'm going through. And we think when we're in despair and life is hard, we think what we need is a miracle. You don't need a miracle, you need Jesus. When we think that when we have blessing, and here's the irony of the story, is that these guys have had their fill, but were they satisfied? No. And they thought the thing that was going to satisfy them was just more of the same thing, more miracles, more signs, more blessings. And this is our human condition. When we're in despair, we think, man, if this situation would just change, my life would be different. That's what we talked about last week. And then we have blessing. We think, okay, this was great. And now we're not content with it. And we look for the next blessing. We look for the next gift. Despair and blessing, when seen from the perspective that Jesus is bringing, should both be seen as signs and things that are drawing us to what is truly life. And so if you have despair, if you have hunger, if you have disappointment, if you have doubts, if you have questions, and you don't have a solution, and you don't know what to do, you have two responses. You can get bitter. But God allows those things in your life so that you might get to this place of despair and saying, Jesus, I have no solutions for this. And that hunger and that thirst actually becomes something that directs you towards Jesus, the bread of life. If you have gifts, if you have blessings, if you have abundance, if there's things going on in your life, the human mistake is to look at this and to say, this is it. And then a week later you realize this isn't it. And then you're looking for the next thing. Maybe this is it. That gift, that blessing, it's a sign that is supposed to point you towards the bread of life because he is the one that truly brings life. In our despair, we can turn to Jesus. We can turn Jesus into a magician, our king that serves our agenda. Or we can say, Jesus, I have no solution for this. What do you want to do? What do you have? In our blessing, we can believe that what we got was the point, or we can see that it's a sign that points to the point. And so the text says that they followed Jesus till they had their fill, every single one of them. Crowds of people, the disciples, 15,000 potentially, all followed Jesus because they had their fill. They all followed Jesus because of what they could get from Jesus. Did my dad leave? Do you know if he took his iPad? We all follow Jesus. Everyone's following Jesus, sorry, I should say, in the story because of what they can get from Jesus, except for one. Except for a nameless, poor boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Everybody else in the story is like, what can I get from Jesus? And there's one nameless boy that says, Jesus, this is all I got. Let me give it to you. Now, here's the difference between the person that gets it and the other 15,000. Is the person that has this insufficient handful of loaves, that is poor, that is nameless. They're just a footnote in the story of Jesus. They show up without any intention of being the star of the story, and they show up and say, Jesus, you're the star, you're the king. This is all I got. I don't know if it's enough, but I'm just going to give it to you. And it's when this nameless boy, instead of trying to get from Jesus, gives to Jesus, that Jesus does something in the insufficiency that becomes sufficient. He does something in the weakness that becomes strong. He does something in the despair that becomes blessing. So I don't know what you have in your hand. But we, like so many people in the Gospel of John, will miss the point if we focus on despair. We'll miss the point if we focus on blessing. But if we, like the little boy, will come to Jesus and say, I don't have answers. I have a little bit of blessing. But Jesus, I know you're the point. Jesus, I know that whatever limitations I have, whatever insufficiencies I have, whatever little I have, I'm just going to bring it and give it to you. Everybody else in the story has a mindset of lack, a mindset of poverty. The little boy in the story just has a posture of faith. And so the question that we get to in the end of the story in John 6 is, do we want Jesus to be a footnote in our story? Do we need him to get on our agenda? Because he's not going to do that. Or are we willing to be a footnote in the story of Jesus? Are we willing to be a nameless boy or girl in the story of Jesus who brought their loaves and their fish and said, this is all I got, and Jesus, what do you want to do with it? And that's what a disciple is. Regardless if you feel like you got a lack or you got a lot, if you're in despair, if you got blessing, it's like whatever you got, just bring it. Whatever you got, just bring it. And then Jesus will do something in your life and through your life because you just brought what you got.